I learned something at 59 years old that probably should have been obvious a lot sooner. The people who talk the most about rules are usually the ones hoping nobody checks whether they're following them. The reason I know that is because one spring in a quiet neighborhood outside Fairview, Indiana, a man named Brandon Cole decided he was going to teach me a lesson about property regulations, fire safety, and what he liked to call civilized living. 2 weeks later, his pride and joy was sitting in a dumpster, his bank account was lighter by more than $20,000, and half the neighborhood was arguing over whether I was a hero, a villain, or just an old guy who finally got tired of being pushed around. My name is Raymond Hayes. I spent almost 3 decades working as a municipal construction compliance officer before retiring. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody throws parades for the guy who checks permit applications and measures setbacks. But after 28 years, you learn things. You learn how buildings are supposed to be built, how inspections work, and most importantly, how often people think they're smarter than the system. When I retired, all I wanted was a quiet life. I bought a modest house, kept my lawn trimmed, waved at the neighbors, and every Saturday morning I fired up an old offset smoker that I'd owned for nearly 15 years. Nothing fancy, rust on the edges, a few dents from moving it around over the years. But that smoker made the best brisket in 3 counties, at least according to my daughter and my grandkids, and honestly their opinion mattered more than anybody else's. The smoke would roll slowly across the yard on Saturday afternoons while I sat in a folding chair with a glass of sweet tea, listening to baseball on the radio. It was peaceful. Then Brandon moved in next door. The first few months weren't terrible. He was younger than me by maybe 15 years, worked in tech, drove expensive vehicles, and seemed determined to remind everybody how successful he was. Every conversation, somehow, turned into a story about investments, executive meetings, vacation properties, or market trends. The kind of guy who could make ordering a sandwich sound like a corporate acquisition. I didn't dislike him at first. I just found him exhausting. Then he started building what he called the ultimate outdoor entertainment space. For nearly 3 months, there were contractors coming and going. Trucks, pallets of stone, gas equipment, concrete crews, landscapers. Every weekend, something new appeared. Eventually, he had a giant outdoor kitchen with stone countertops, a commercial-grade grill, a pizza oven, built-in lighting, a refrigerator, and enough seating for 20 people. I'll admit it looked impressive. It also looked expensive enough to make my retirement account nervous just looking at it. Brandon loved showing it off. Every chance he got, he'd walk guests around it like a museum curator. Sometimes I'd hear him from my yard explaining features nobody asked about. The imported stone, the custom gas system, the premium appliances, the smart controls. One evening, he actually spent 10 minutes explaining his countertop material to a guy who clearly just wanted another beer. Looking back, maybe that's when the tension started. Not because I cared about his kitchen, but because he seemed bothered by the fact that I didn't care. Then came a Thursday afternoon that changed everything. I got home from town carrying groceries and noticed a bright orange notice taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I started reading. Fire safety review required. Compliance inspection pending. Administrative fee due. I stood there blinking at the paper like it was written in another language. The notice claimed my smoker had been reported as a recurring fire hazard and required a formal inspection process. The fee alone was hundreds of dollars. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. My smoker sat over 30 feet from any structure on a gravel pad, exactly where local regulations required. I knew because I used to enforce those regulations. So I called the number listed on the notice. The woman who answered was polite. She looked up the file and then got quiet for a second. Finally, she said, "Mr. Hayes, the complaint came from a neighboring property owner. It was filed formally and included documentation." Documentation. That word stuck with me. Nobody writes a detailed complaint by accident. Somebody had spent time on this. Somebody wanted this. I asked who filed it. She couldn't officially tell me, but she didn't really need to. 10 minutes later, I walked outside and saw Brandon standing beside his outdoor kitchen, talking to 2 guests. The second our eyes met, I knew. You know those moments when somebody's expression gives away an entire conversation before a single word is spoken? It was one of those moments. So I walked over. Calm. Respectful. At least at first. "Hey, Brandon," I said. "Can I ask you something?" He smiled. "Sure. Did you file a complaint about my smoker?" His smile didn't disappear. It got bigger. "Actually, yes. I did." And right there, standing beside the outdoor kitchen he loved showing off, with his guests only a few feet away, he started explaining why. He said it like he was explaining something completely reasonable. According to Brandon, the smoke drifted across his yard and interfered with outdoor dinners. He claimed guests complained about the smell. He claimed it affected the atmosphere. He even said the appearance of smoke rising above the fence created what he called a negative visual experience. I remember standing there wondering if I was actually having this conversation or if I'd somehow wandered into a parody of suburban life. I tried being polite. I told him I only used the smoker on Saturdays. I told him it ran maybe once a week, sometimes less during winter. I even offered to let him know ahead of time if he had some big event planned. Most neighbors would have accepted that compromise. Brandon wasn't interested in compromise. He folded his arms and said, "Honestly, Ray, the issue isn't really the schedule. The issue is that regulations exist for a reason. People should follow them." Now that got my attention because I knew the regulations. Better than he did. Better than almost anyone in the county. So I asked him what regulation he thought I was violating. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then he said, "Well, that's for the inspectors to determine." In other words, he had no idea. He just wanted somebody with authority to hassle me. Then came the comment that changed everything. He looked at my smoker, then back at me, and shrugged. "Maybe if you understood codes the way some of us do, you wouldn't be dealing with this. But that's what happens when working-class guys try to play property owner." His guests laughed awkwardly. Not because the joke was funny, because they could tell he had crossed a line. I didn't respond. I just nodded once and walked back to my house. That's the part people usually get wrong when they hear this story. They imagine I stormed home angry and started plotting revenge. The truth is I sat quietly on my back porch for almost an hour. I watched the sun go down. I listened to birds settling into the trees. I thought about all the years I'd spent in government service. Thousands of inspections. Thousands of conversations. Some people appreciated the rules. Some people hated them. But the worst were always the ones who weaponized regulations against others while assuming nobody would ever look at their own property. Around 8 that night, I went inside, made a cup of coffee, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. Old habits die hard. The county property database was still publicly accessible. Permit records were searchable. Inspection records were searchable. Property surveys were searchable. I typed Brandon's address into the system. The first thing I noticed was strange. No active permit history connected to the outdoor kitchen. That didn't automatically mean anything. Sometimes records were delayed. Sometimes permits were filed under contractors. So I kept digging. An hour later, my eyebrows were climbing higher every few minutes. No structural permits. No utility permits. No gas permits. No final inspections. Nothing. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe paperwork hadn't been uploaded. Maybe permits existed somewhere else. So the next morning, I visited the county records office and pulled archive files. Still nothing. By lunchtime, I was no longer curious. I was concerned, because if that outdoor kitchen had been built the way it appeared to be built, there should have been a paper trail. There wasn't. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. The gas line feeding the grill and pizza oven appeared to have been installed after construction. That usually required additional approval. I found none. Then I requested the latest property survey. That's when things became interesting. Very interesting. I spread the survey across my kitchen table and compared measurements against aerial imagery. Then I went outside with a measuring wheel. 20 minutes later, I stood near the property line, staring at Brandon's outdoor kitchen and quietly laughed to myself. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe someone had been so careless. Part of the structure appeared to extend beyond allowable setbacks. Not by inches, by feet. Worse than that, a section of the stone patio appeared to cross into community-owned property managed by the neighborhood association. I checked the measurements 3 times. Same result every time. Now let me be clear. I didn't create those violations. I didn't exaggerate them. I didn't invent anything. They were already there. The only difference was that Brandon had chosen the wrong retired inspector to harass. By Sunday evening, I had assembled a folder thick enough to make a county attorney smile. Property surveys, photographs, measurement records, public documents, permit searches, code references, everything organized neatly because that's how I'd done my job for 28 years. Monday morning, I filed 3 formal complaints. Unpermitted construction, potentially unlicensed gas installation, property encroachment. Then I sent copies to the county compliance office, the neighborhood association, and the fire prevention bureau. After that, I went about my day. I mowed the lawn, bought groceries, watched a ball game. The funny thing about bureaucracy is that once paperwork enters the system, it develops a life of its own. Tuesday morning, a county vehicle pulled into Brandon's driveway. I happened to be trimming hedges when it arrived. The inspector stepped out and immediately recognized me. His name was Ethan. Years earlier, he had trained under me. We exchanged a quick wave. Brandon didn't notice. He was too busy smiling confidently as he greeted the inspection team. At first, about 40 minutes later, that smile was gone. By the second hour, he looked irritated. By the third hour, he looked worried. They measured everything. They photographed everything. They examined utility connections. They reviewed records. Around mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. Only 4 words. You found a mess. That evening, more county vehicles arrived. Then representatives from the Homeowners Association showed up the next day. Then another review occurred involving the gas installation. Every time someone new examined the project, another problem surfaced. I watched Brandon pacing his driveway, phone glued to his ear, trying desperately to reach contractors. Some calls ended quickly. Some weren't answered at all. Apparently, the company that built portions of the project no longer operated under the same name. Funny how that happens. By Friday, the official findings started arriving. The construction lacked required approvals. Portions violated setback requirements. The gas installation raised serious compliance concerns. Corrective action was mandatory. Financial penalties followed. Brandon wasn't just facing paperwork anymore. He was facing consequences. Real ones. One afternoon, I saw him standing in his driveway, holding several documents while arguing with someone over speakerphone. His voice carried across the street. "What do you mean you're not responsible?" he shouted. "You told me everything was covered." There was a long pause. Then another burst of yelling. Then silence. He hung up and just stood there staring at the ground. For a brief moment, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Then I remembered the orange notice taped to my door. I remembered the smirk. I remembered the comment about working-class people pretending to be homeowners. Sympathy has limits. The following week, the situation escalated even further. Insurance wouldn't help because unapproved construction created coverage complications. The association began discussing enforcement measures. Legal notices appeared. Deadlines were established. Every day, Brandon looked more exhausted. Every day, his confidence shrank a little more. Then one evening, I witnessed something that made me realize the pressure was spreading beyond him. His wife stepped outside holding paperwork. They started talking. Talking became arguing. Arguing became shouting. She pointed toward the outdoor kitchen. He pointed toward the documents. Neither looked happy. Finally, she threw her hands in the air, walked back inside, and slammed the door hard enough for me to hear it from my porch. Brandon remained outside alone. For the first time since all this started, he didn't look arrogant. He looked scared, and that's when I knew the story wasn't over yet. And once fear shows up, pride usually isn't far behind. For a few more days, Brandon kept fighting, filing responses, making calls, trying to negotiate extensions, trying to convince people that the problems weren't really problems. But regulations don't care how confident you sound, and paperwork doesn't become legal just because somebody spent a lot of money on it. The deadlines kept moving closer. The notices kept arriving. The numbers kept growing. Then on the 10th day after the inspections began, I heard a knock at my front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Brandon stood there looking like a completely different person than the man who had smirked at me beside his outdoor kitchen. His eyes were tired. His shoulders sagged. Even his voice sounded different. "Ray," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked toward his house, then back at me. Finally, he asked the question he'd probably been rehearsing for days. Did you report me? I could have lied. I could have avoided it. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye and said, yes. He stared at me. What? That question actually surprised me. Not because he asked it, but because he genuinely seemed confused. As if the connection between his actions and the consequences standing in front of him had never occurred to him. I shrugged. Because you wanted the county involved. He shook his head. That's not the same thing. No. I asked. You filed a complaint hoping inspectors would find a problem on my property. Inspectors looked at yours instead. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For a second, I almost thought he understood. Then pride stepped back in. You knew what this would do, he said. You knew how much this could cost me. I nodded. Probably about as well as you knew what your complaint would cost me. His face turned red. This is different. That's when I smiled. Not a mean smile. Not a cruel one. Just the kind of smile that appears when someone accidentally walks into their own lesson. Maybe if you understood the codes the way you thought you did, I said, you wouldn't be in this situation. He froze. He recognized his own words immediately. I let the silence hang there for a moment before adding. Turns out that's what happens when executives try to play contractor. For a second, I thought he might explode. Instead, he just stood there looking defeated. There wasn't really anything left to say. The facts were the facts. The violations were documented. The deadlines were real. Eventually, he turned around and walked back across the lawn without another word. 4 days later, the final deadline arrived. Early that morning, trucks rolled into the neighborhood. A demolition crew followed. Several workers stepped out carrying tools, equipment, and clipboards. The neighborhood came alive almost instantly. Curtains moved. Garage doors opened. People found excuses to check their mail. Nothing attracts attention quite like watching expensive mistakes being dismantled in broad daylight. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched. Piece by piece, the outdoor kitchen disappeared. The stone counters came out first. Then sections of the patio. The built-in grill. The pizza oven. Utility lines. Decorative features. Everything Brandon had proudly shown off for nearly a year vanished in a matter of hours. What had taken months to build disappeared before dinner. Around lunchtime, I looked over and saw Brandon standing near the edge of his yard. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't making phone calls. He just stood there silently watching. And honestly, that was the moment I finally felt a little sorry for him. Not because the consequences were unfair. They weren't. Not because he didn't bring them on himself. He absolutely did. I felt sorry for him because I realized he had probably convinced himself he was smarter than everyone else for so long that he'd stopped questioning his own decisions. That's a dangerous habit. By late afternoon, the job was finished. Where the outdoor kitchen once stood was nothing but disturbed dirt, tire tracks, and a few construction markings. The total financial damage ended up being well over $20,000 once fines, removal costs, corrective work, legal consultations, and contractor fees were added together. A very expensive lesson. The following Saturday morning felt strangely normal. The sky was clear. The weather was perfect. I wheeled my old smoker into position, loaded it with oak wood, and started a brisket before sunrise. A few hours later, thin blue smoke drifted lazily into the air. I settled into my chair with a cold drink and listened to the gentle crackle of the firebox. Across the fence, Brandon stepped outside. For a moment, he looked at the empty patch of dirt where his outdoor kitchen used to be. Then he noticed the smoke. Our eyes met. I raised a hand and gave him a friendly wave. Not a mocking one, just a wave. He stared for a second, shook his head, and went back inside. I never received another complaint. We were never friends after that, but we became something better than enemies. We became neighbors who understood boundaries. Not just property lines, but personal ones too. Looking back now, years later, the strangest part isn't the money he lost or the kitchen that disappeared. It's how easily all of it could have been avoided. If he'd simply knocked on my door and talked to me like a human being, we probably would have worked something out in 10 minutes. Instead, he chose authority, paperwork, and arrogance. Then he discovered those things have a way of coming back around. So here's what I want to ask you. Was I justified for reporting what I found? Or should I have let it go and taken the high road? When somebody tries to use the rules against you while ignoring their own violations, what does fairness actually look like? I'd really like to hear your thoughts because even now, people in that neighborhood still disagree about who is right. Drop your opinion in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who thought the rules only applied to everyone else, share your story too. I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's lived through something like this.